The slasher genre is all about gruesome deaths, all played out for the sick and twisted pleasure of the viewer. In a world of carnage and mayhem, it seems only fitting that survival isn't always the best outcome for our characters. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 slasher movie fates worse than death. Number 10. Resurrected as a skinless corpse after being torn to pieces. Hellraiser. Hellraiser begins with Frank Cotton traveling to Morocco. He's come to a market there in search of hedonistic pleasure. It's at this market that he finds the Lament configuration, a seemingly harmless puzzle that when solved will apparently give Frank the pleasures he desires. To Frank's surprise, upon completion of the puzzle, hooks and chains tear through the walls and sink themselves into his skin. It's a horrifically gory way to die. Frank is brought back to life when his brother moves into his old house, apparently unconcerned with Frank's disappearance. His brother Larry accidentally cuts himself in the attic, and the blood opens up the portal again, helping Frank to break through, this time as a disgusting skinless corpse. At this point, Frank will do absolutely anything to get a real body, including murdering and draining people of their own life to give it back to himself. No one's safe from Frank's desperate wrath. Number 9. Gaslit and Framed for the murder of your family and friends. Happy birthday to me. Jenny's a young girl that recently became part of her school's most popular clique when her friends are gradually killed off as her birthday nears. Around halfway through the movie, Jenny recovers her lost memories and realizes that her friends were partially to blame for her mother's death. At the same point, we the audience are treated to our first sight of the killer, and it turns out to be none other than Jenny herself. Jenny thinks she's gone absolutely crazy, but everything is not as it seems. A deranged birthday party in the climax sees Jenny surrounding herself with the corpses of her friends. However, who we believe to be Jenny turns out to be another character, Anne, in a latex mask. Anne has plotted the whole thing to frame Jenny as revenge for her mother having an affair with Anne's father, making the girls half-sisters. Jenny manages to overpower and kill Anne, but as she stands over Anne's body, the police are left with only one conclusion: Jenny was the culprit all along, and we're left with the bleak realization that Jenny will spend the rest of her life in prison. Number 8. Trapped in a mineshaft and forced to eat your co-workers to survive. My Bloody Valentine. So the movie begins underground, telling the audience the story about the Valentine's Day miner tragedy that plagued the town 25 years before the film's events. On the night of the Valentine's dance, the foreman in charge of the town's mining shaft left their crew unsupervised so that they could attend the dance. The foreman forgot to check the methane gas levels, and consequently there was an explosion that trapped 5 miners in the shaft. By the time the town managed to recover the buried miners, only one of them had survived. The sole survivor, Harry Warden, managed to stay alive for the 6 weeks he was trapped by eating his fellow co-workers. The poor kid was driven completely insane from being trapped in such a tight space, having to watch as his friends and colleagues die painfully and subsequently feasting on their rotting flesh to stay alive. Harry is so damaged by the trauma, he has to spend the rest of his life in a mental institute, but not before going on a murder spree. Number 7. Soul gets trapped in a kid's toy. Child's Play. Before Annabelle was a thing, Chucky was the scariest children's doll of all time, and even now he could give the possessed conjuring star a run for her money. He may look cute, but Chucky sadistically kills anyone who gets in his way. He's vicious and callous, not the usual temperament of a kid's toy really. That's because he isn't a kid's toy really. Chucky is actually Charles Lee Ray, a fictional serial killer that transferred his body into a good guy doll. He's killed and resurrected countless times throughout the franchise, while he desperately tries time and time again to transfer his soul back into a human body. He hates his life as a doll so much, he doesn't even care if that body belongs to a child. Anything is better than the life he has. He feels every gunshot, knife wound, and fireplace burn forced upon him as if he was still human. His suffering is endless, though nothing less than deserved. Number 6. Kidnapped and forcefully impregnated with a turkey baster. Don't Breathe. When Rocky, Alex, and Money lay out their plan to break into a blind veteran's house in Don't Breathe, we learned that the man had recently come into quite a bit of settlement money. Apparently, his daughter had been killed in a car accident by a wealthy woman named Cindy, and that the crime was settled outside of court. Not only is this the catalyst that sets off the movie's plot, but we find out about halfway through that this throwaway mention to the car crash is actually more important than you would have ever thought. When things start to go awry, Rocky and Alex attempt to escape the house through the basement, and what they find tied up and gagged is a pregnant Cindy. The blind veteran had kidnapped her, tied her up, and artificially inseminated her with his child as a replacement for his dead daughter. It's a controversial twist that definitely affected its audience, and for good reason. It is brutal, sick, and disgusting, and the woman looks absolutely terrified when we meet her. Cindy is eventually accidentally killed, but she probably wished it had come sooner. Number 5. Trapped in an unending horror movie. The Final Girls. Everyone has that nightmare where they're trapped inside a terrifying horror movie. Now imagine being unable to wake up from that nightmare. That was the situation that Max and her group of horror movie obsessed friends found themselves in. At a screening of a famous slasher movie, the group have to hack their way through the screen to escape a fire in the theater. It doesn't take long for the dysfunctional Scooby Gang to realize they've torn into the world of the movie. This may sound cool, and the characters themselves are pretty psyched too, until they realize they'll have to come face to face with the movie's killer. One by one, Max's friends are brutally killed along with the movie's cast of characters until she's the only one left. At the end of the film, when Max has faced off with the killer and survived, she wakes up relieved to find all of her dead friends are with her in hospital, recovering from the injuries given to them in the movie. We all collectively sigh with relief until we hear the signature horror movie music start once again, and we realize the group are all still trapped, this time in the sequel. Number 4. No choice but to hide in a padded cell. Final Destination. These movies show us that we cannot run away from our death, and that if we do, we may end up in a worse position than before, as death will follow you until he finds you. Claire Rivers found this out the hard way. After watching all of her friends die in gruesome and merciless ways, Claire realized after her own almost run-ins with death that she was gonna have to go to extreme lengths to keep him at bay. When we last see Claire at the ending of Final Destination, she and the only other 2 survivors of the movie believe that they're finally safe, only for one of the 2 boys with Claire to be killed in the final seconds before the credits roll. We meet Claire again in Final Destination 2 and find out that she's truly lost everything. She's now the only survivor left from the first movie, and to escape death indefinitely, she's locked herself away in a padded cell. Her new life is bleak and miserable, and Claire is on the verge of insanity because of the paranoia her life has led her to. She's constantly on the lookout for dangers that could kill her, and she's completely isolated herself from the world. Number 3. Chased by a killer demon for the rest of your life. It Follows. At the beginning of the movie, we see average American teenager Jay going about her suburban life as usual, from watching movies with friends to dating a cute out-of-town boy named Hugh. But her usual life is stopped short the night she decides to finally sleep with Hugh. Turns out Hugh has contracted a sexual disease demon and has been on the run trying to find some innocent girl to transfer it to. Poor Jay becomes that victim, and Hugh explains to her, as she's tied to a wheelchair, that for the rest of her life, this mysterious demon will follow her wherever she goes, and when it catches up to her, it will gruesomely kill Jay by sexually assaulting her. For the rest of the movie, Jay has to run, drive, swim, and crawl away as this horrifying demon gets closer and closer to her. Just when you think that her and her friends have trapped and killed the demon and that Jay is finally free, we're faced with the bleak truth. As the credits roll, we see a figure looming in the background of the shot, slowly trailing after our protagonist once again. Number 2. Kidnapped by a cult and impregnated with your uncle's baby. Halloween 6. When Jamie Lee Curtis refused to appear in the franchise as Laurie anymore, her character is unceremoniously killed off screen in a car crash, and we're thusly introduced to her daughter. She's placed into foster care, bullied in school for being related to the town's infamous killer, and suffers horrific nightmares about her uncle, Michael Myers. The 4th movie follows Jamie as she's hunted down by Michael Myers and eventually possessed by him to try and murder her foster parents. In the 5th movie, Jamie's imprisoned in a children's mental institute and framed for the attempted murder of her foster mum, as no one believes that she was possessed for it. When Michael is caught and imprisoned, a man in black helps him escape, and the man kidnaps Jamie. From there, we find out what happens to Jamie in a deleted scene from Halloween 6. After being kidnapped by the man in black, Jamie's forced to live with the Thorn cult for 6 years, and it's within that time that teenage Jamie is artificially inseminated with her uncle's child. Number 1. Blinded and forced to live in a pit. Wrong Turn. The Wrong Turn franchise is mostly known nowadays for its gross-out gore and direct-to-DVD sequels that are just there to try and outdo the disgusting visuals of the film before. The 2021 reboot decided to actually try hard and give us a well-made new age look at the infamous franchise. Instead of the cannibalistic inbred villains from before, the reboot introduces a cult founded prior to the Civil War that boasts a primitive life in the Appalachians. When our group of ragtag college graduates unwittingly cross paths with the barbaric cult not on a hiking trip, casualties and misunderstandings on both sides lead to the Foundation kidnapping and putting the kids on trial. When they're found guilty of lying, the 3 kids that are left are sentenced to darkness. We watch as one of the characters gets his eyes burnt closed. He's then subsequently thrown into a dark pit, where every other victim of this fate is sent to wander around in the dark for the rest of their days. It's absolutely barbaric, and the extensive torment these people have to go through is quite literally dark as all hell.
Science fiction's speculative nature allows it to tackle futuristic hypothetical concepts that could never take place in the real world. As such, when the genre crosses over with horror, the on-screen results are endlessly horrifying. The unfortunate nominees here would take death 1,000 times over if it meant an escape from the nightmarish destiny their respective film bestows upon them. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie with What Culture here with 10 sci-fi horror movie fates worse than death. Number 10. Trapped in the Mirror World in Mirrors. Panned by critics and audiences alike, Kiefer Sutherland's Mirrors is an unmitigated disaster of a horror film. Listless performances and a comically nonsensical plot mean that this is a movie-going experience that should be avoided at all costs. With that being said, the 2008 sci-fi horror does possess one of the nastier fates in recent memory. The demon terrorizing Sutherland's Ben Carson and his family within the film inhabits the mirror dimension, a mirrored version of reality accessible through reflected surfaces. Sutherland's character collapses a building on himself and supporting character Anna in the climactic sequence after she is possessed by said demon. Mirror's final twist comes when Ben realizes nobody can see him after having arduously dragged himself from the rubble. Sutherland's befuddled character suddenly registers that everything is reflected when he notices a name tag written backwards, and the horrifying pieces finally fall into place. Ben died when the building came crashing down and is now trapped alone in the mirror dimension, doomed to forever observe the world without being able to interact with it. The sickening concept of such an endless state of purgatory is an infinitely more harrowing notion than that of a swift demise. Number 9. Lobotomized and returned to the Cube in Cube Zero. The Kafkaesque Cube franchise has always received a generally positive reception from horror audiences. The darkly dystopian universe isn't the best creation that horror has to offer, but always results in a thrilling cinematic experience. As such, fans are willing to overlook some of the shakier CGI and more nonsensical plotlines in a trilogy that has garnered cult classic status. Everybody knows the drill in the Cube by now. Anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves trapped in this appalling landscape has to navigate some form of sadistic booby trap to move to the next room. The trilogy's third installment, Cube Zero, sees Eric, a technician in the facility, enter the Cube to rescue a test subject after realizing that participation in the twisted game is involuntary. Tragically, all Eric's good Samaritan nature does is buy him a fate that would make Prometheus wince. While he succeeds in helping the test subject escape the facility, he is unable to avoid being captured in the process. The sinister powers that run the facility reveal that Eric actually agreed to become a test subject years ago, before lobotomizing him and returning him to the Cube. Number 8. Cannibalized while still alive in The Platform. Set in an enormous concrete tower, Spanish sci-fi horror The Platform is a dystopian triumph. An enormous banquet of food descends on a platform every day, stopping for a brief amount of time on every level, each of which houses 2 residents. Accordingly, those on the higher levels get the pick of the grub, while those below are left to pray that some food remains by the time the feast reaches them. The residents are randomly swapped between the floors every month, waking up on a different floor with no warning. Protagonist Goreng soon discovers why being sent to the lower levels is a fate worse than death. Being faced with starvation brings out the darkest traits in people, highlighting the depraved depths that some will go to in order to survive. One might get lucky and be quickly killed in their sleep, but Goreng is thrust headfirst into the worst-case lower levels scenario. Following their reassignment to level 171, Goreng awakes to find himself tied to his bed by cellmate Trimagasi. The twisted old man plans to use him as a human smorgasbord to sustain them both, eating carefully rationed strips of Goreng's flesh until they are hopefully restored to a higher level. While Goreng is eventually saved, this shudder-worthy fate would have been infinitely worse than a quick knife in the heart. Number 7. Becoming a Prawn in District 9. James Cameron had a bad year at the Academy Awards in 2009. Not only was Avatar upstaged in terms of dramatic quality by The Hurt Locker, the legendary director arguably didn't even produce the best sci-fi-centric picture of the year. That prestigious honour went to Neil Blomkamp's triumphant masterpiece, District 9. Blowing modest expectations out of the water, the film was a critical and commercial smash hit. Blomkamp's offering depicts an alternate version of reality, one in which extraterrestrials landed on Earth. These visitors from outer space are shunned in a depressingly morbid parallel of the real-life migration crisis. Contemptuously dubbed prawns, the aliens are treated in barbarically subhuman fashion and segregated to an enormous sprawling shantytown, the film's titular District 9. Under such a ruthless status quo, it is not an exaggeration to suggest that becoming a prawn is a fate far worse than death. Regrettably for protagonist Vicus, this is exactly the situation he finds himself in after becoming exposed to an alien liquid. The mild-mannered employee from the Department of Alien Affairs soon discovers how quickly human beings will turn on their own kind, as he is mercilessly turned on and hunted by members of his own species, looking to exploit his condition to their advantage. While District 9 is primarily a sci-fi movie, the implications of Vicus's fate are so horrifying that he merits inclusion on this list. Number 6. Being cloned endlessly in Moon. Sam Rockwell's existence in Moon is already a morbid state of affairs. Rockwell's protagonist Sam Bell is the sole operative of a facility on the Moon, set up to extract futuristic fuel helium-3. The only human being for hundreds of thousands of miles, Bell's sole source of companionship in this lunar purgatory is the station's artificial intelligence system, Gertie. While Sam believes he is on a 3-year contract and due to soon return to Earth, his employers, Lunar Industries, have in fact cloned the real Sam Bell hundreds of times. The versions of Bell featured within the film are merely genetic replicants of the original astronaut, brought to life for no other purpose than to provide cheap labour and save on the cost of training new astronauts. When one dies, another takes its place. Slavery where the participants are unaware of their status as slaves. In a further abhorrent twist, once they have fulfilled their use, the clones enter hibernation in preparation for their return to Earth. Lunar Industries then incinerate them in their sleep before the heinous cycle starts all over again. There isn't even a prospect of real freedom. Mirroring Bell's original contract length, the clones only have a 3-year lifespan. As such, even the version who escapes has less time remaining to him than the average house cat. Contravening every principle concerning free will that a human being has, this endless cycle of wicked exploitation arguably represents a fate far worse than death. Number 5. Elizabeth Shaw's entire storyline in Prometheus and Alien Covenant. Shaw lands herself a place on this list after her entire life turns into a sci-fi horror fate worse than death. The Alien franchise reboot Prometheus sees the titular ship travel to a distant solar system in search of mankind's creators, where Noomi Rapace's character is soon revealed to be the franchise's new whipping girl. Shaw lurches from one harrowing experience to the next, any one of which would have the average person pleading to be put out of their misery. Her love interest Holloway is barbecued before her very eyes to begin with, but this is just the entree. Sleeping with the infected archaeologist the night before impregnated her with a xenomorph variant. The insidious corporation behind the expedition attempts to put her back into cryostasis so the organism can be studied on their return to Earth. While Shaw avoids the nauseating fate, the alternative is only slightly better. Elizabeth is forced to use a medical machine to remove the abhorrent fetus, all while entirely conscious. Even the Doctor's fate at the end of Prometheus is arguably far worse than death. The lone human survivor, millions of miles from home, with only murderous cyborg David for company? Shaw isn't even allowed to die peacefully. The sequel, Alien Covenant, reveals that David eventually overpowered her, using her dissected corpse in his twisted xenomorph experiments. Number 4. Turning into a fly and fused to machinery in The Fly. There's a reason that Rick and Morty dubbed humans transformed into hideously deformed monstrosities as Cronenbergs. This tongue-in-cheek tribute to director David Cronenberg is even more appropriate when one considers the fate of Jeff Goldblum's Seth Brundle in 1986's The Fly. Goldblum plays an eccentric scientist experimenting with the concept of teleportation, who accidentally becomes genetically amalgamated with a fly after it enters his teleportation pod with him. Brundle slowly transforms into the most repulsive of creatures as he steadily loses his grip on reality. The bristly hairs and the wince-worthy sores are horrifying enough, but viewers legitimately have to resist the urge to barf when Goldblum reveals his eating habits. Like a fly, the scientist now vomits a vile white liquid onto his food, pre-digesting it before he swallows it. Rather unsurprisingly, Brundle barely even resembles a human being by the film's end. Already living a fate far worse than death, Brundle's final agonizing piece of destiny comes around in the fly's climactic sequence. Attempting to fuse himself with his pregnant girlfriend in order to become the most twisted family ever conceived, the process goes disastrously wrong. Brundle melds himself with the teleportation pod instead, resulting in a monstrously deformed insect humanoid horrendously fused with scientific equipment. Goldblum's repulsive creature is left silently pleading for death in unspeakable agony. It speaks volumes that a shotgun blast to the head was a more appealing option than his current predicament. Number 3. Being trapped in the sunken place in Get Out. Individual autonomy, freedom to be our own person and make our own choices, is the driving force at the heart of what makes us human. The idea of being trapped in one's own body, utterly powerless over the decisions and actions that we alone were quite literally born to carry out, is a truly desolate notion, infinitely worse than death. Chillingly, this existence is precisely what awaits the victims of Get Out's insidious Armitage family. The process that the sickening clan have created essentially allows for minds to be transplanted between human subjects. The intrusive party then takes over the body of the host. Said unfortunate host's conscience is then left to rot in the dark and endless purgatory of the realm dubbed the Sunken Place. This harrowing state of affairs means that those banished to this hellish limbo can see everything in their life playing out, as if they were watching a television screen from the bottom of a swimming pool. However, they have absolutely no free will or control over their own body, doomed to scream silently in the black abyss until their mortal body finally perishes. While protagonist Chris manages to escape this hellish scenario, Get Out depicts 3 people who have undergone this nightmarish procedure, with the implication of many more. Thankfully, the film's conclusion sees the demise of hosts Georgina and Walter, death mercifully freeing their original selves from this blood-curdling fate. Number 2. Being jettisoned into deep space in Life. 2017's Life is decidedly not for you if you enjoy a happy ending. The movie sees a group of astronauts aboard the International Space Station come into contact with an extraterrestrial organism from Mars. Meet Calvin. Soon revealing a predatory nature, Calvin ruthlessly wipes out the entire crew across a nail-biting 104 minutes. Only Jake Gyllenhaal's David Jordan and Rebecca Ferguson's Miranda North are left standing by the time the film's thrilling climax rolls around. Jordan attempts to lure Calvin into one of the 2 escape pods, planning to fly it into deep space to protect Earth from the murderous Martian. North, meanwhile, will pilot the other pod home, reluctantly acquiescing to his heroic sacrifice. One of the escape vehicles is shown being hit by debris on attempting re-entry, but when the dust settles, a pod has successfully landed in the sea. Against all odds, the plan appears to have worked. Not a chance. The pod is revealed to be David's, complete with his abominable passenger in tow. Unable to understand his warnings, the fishermen who discover the vehicle open it, presumably letting Calvin loose on Earth as the film ends. Meanwhile, the other pod plummets uncontrollably into deep space as Miranda screams in despair. Utterly alone in the endless darkness millions of miles from home, her only way out is starvation or suffocation. Ryan Reynolds may have died horribly, but at least he died quickly. Number 1. Killing your own son in the mist. What's that old saying about hindsight? Adapting Stephen King's novel for the big screen, The Mist's plot sees the titular paranormal weather envelop Bridgeton, Maine. The Mist comes complete with supernatural occurrences and hellish creatures. Thomas Jane's David Drayton finds himself barricaded in a supermarket with his young son Billy, along with several other survivors as a result. The Mist descends into usual tropes of apocalyptic fashion, complete with a religious mumbo-jumbo spouting whack job, but notably manages to do so in gripping fashion. True to genre stereotypes, the film sees the initial group of survivors gradually whittled down until only David, Billy, and 3 other survivors remain. Trapped in the mist after their car runs out of gas, the group decides to commit suicide in order to spare themselves a horrific death at the hands of the monsters. David makes the heartbreaking decision to use his remaining 4 bullets, not only for them, but for Billy. The truly devastating aspect of David's fate is that he thinks he is doing the right thing by giving his son a quick death, choosing to brave the monsters instead of shooting himself. In the most sadistic of plot twists, the mist soon clears after David leaves the car, revealing soldiers wiping out the creatures. As he drops to his knees screaming in unabated horror, it is clear that any manner of horrific death would have been preferable to killing one's own son mere minutes away from safety.
When done right, there's nothing quite as unsettling as a clever found footage film. While death is certainly a very common occurrence in this subgenre, there are those times in a found footage movie where death seems like a far more appealing option than what we see play out. With that in mind then, I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 9 found footage fates worse than death. Number 9. Watching your friends suffer. Host. 2020 was a year in which the world was turned upside down, with quarantine restrictions and lockdown regulations in place across the globe. From the minds of Rob Savage, Gemma Hurley, and Jed Shepard, though, Host managed to take this painfully real situation and use it as the launching point for one of the most impressive horrors of the year. Like the rest of us, the core cast of Host find themselves partaking in weekly Zoom calls to help pass the monotony of lockdown life and isolation. What was unique about the particular video chat featured in this picture, though, is that it began with a fake seance that ultimately led to a very real demonic presence coming to the fore. By the time this swift 56-minute offering concludes, the only fates left up in the air are those of Gemma and Haley, as the rest of the characters have had their heads smashed into their PC screen, their necks broken, been burned alive, or terrified enough to cause their own death. For Gemma and Haley, they've had to watch the majority of these brutal ordeals unravel for their friends, all while being tormented themselves, up until the movie ends as the call's Zoom timer runs out. Number 8. Being seduced and haunted by your would-be murderer. Creep 2. The first 2014 movie saw Mark Duplass's Joseph out to have his own story detailed for his unborn child. At this point, the belief is that Joseph is terminally ill, and thus aspiring filmmaker Aaron is roped in to document this tale. For Aaron, it all ended grimly in Creep, with him axed to death by Joseph. By the time of Creep 2, Joseph had taken on the name of Aaron and sought out Sarah as his next documentarian. This time, though, Sarah embraces the eccentricities of Aaron, happily believing that his shtick is merely an act. Sarah's fate is a strange one, for her humoring of Joseph, Aaron, whoever, means she falls for the guy, becoming romantically involved before she's then stabbed and dragged into an empty waiting grave that's been put aside for her. Despite the odds, Sarah survives this encounter and makes her escape, with Aaron left for dead. A final scene shows Sarah being filmed on public transport by an unseen figure, whistling a song associated with Aaron. As Sarah looks up in shock, Creep 2 cuts to a close, with it unknown whether this was really Aaron, or even worse, that Sarah is so messed up by her ordeal that she's imagining all this. Number 7. Trapped with the Blair Witch. The Blair Witch Project. When Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez's picture arrived in 1999, it was an absolute game changer. Keep in mind that this was a time when the internet was still in its relative infancy, and the Blair Witch Project managed to convince so many people that this really was footage found after a group of 3 filmmakers had gone missing. Throughout the 81-minute runtime of the Blair Witch Project, the fate of the Heather, Mike, and Josh trio is technically left ambiguous. While it's presumed that all 3 died, the actual death of any of the 3 of them is never shown on screen. It's safe to assume that things didn't turn out all that well for the 3, but in terms of what we, the audience, see, worse than actual death is what Heather is confronted with in the final minutes of the movie. There, Heather sees the visage of Josh in the corner of a room staring at the wall, which ties into the eerie legend that the Blair Witch would force a person to stand in the corner of a room as it tortures someone else, and makes Heather realize that these purported old wives' tales are probably harrowingly real. Number 6. That feeling of regretful helplessness. Lake Mungo. The premise of Lake Mungo centers on a family struggling to deal with the death of their daughter. While the film is every inch a horror movie, with supernatural elements coming to the fore as the tale unravels, it's also a tale, first and foremost, of grief and dealing with loss. In that regard, it's haunting in more ways than merely the obvious. Alice is the daughter here, with the troubled teen seeking medical advice after feeling something awful is going to happen to her. From there, the audience sees a grainy phone recording of Alice confronted by a drowned, bloated version of herself. While it's heartbreaking to see that Alice had a premonition of her own demise, there's an additional level of heartache at seeing how regretful her family are that they were unable to help the youngster during her greatest time of need. Adding a further blow, Alice's family also uncover a video recording of their 16-year-old daughter engaged in a sexual encounter with their husband and wife neighbors. Number 5. Embracing insanity and lobotomization. Grave Encounters. Given how the found footage subgenre was one very much associated with serving up dross by the time the 2000s rolled into the 2010s, 2011's Grave Encounters was a proverbial diamond in the rough. Sure, this Vicious Brothers vehicle isn't a flawless piece of chilling cinematic perfection, but it is so much better than the majority of similar found footage offerings being served up at that point. The premise of the picture sees ghost hunting TV presenter Lance Preston take his crew to the phenomena-laced Collingwood Psychiatric Hospital for the final episode of his Grave Encounters series. Intending to spend the night at this spooky locale, Preston and his cohorts find themselves trapped in the dark, never-ending corridors of the hospital, with their fate a wince-inducing one. As Grave Encounters hits its final act, our explorers realize they've become patients of Collingwood, with some of the group becoming deranged. Literal bloodbaths and elevator shaft falls befit some of the team, but the worst fate awaits Lance. Wandering endless tunnels feeding on rats, Lance stumbles upon an old operating room where he's snatched by a gaggle of demonic nurses and forced to undergo a lobotomy. Number 4. Becoming reanimated mutants. The Dyatlov Pass Incident. Exploring the very real mystery of the death of 9 hikers in 1959, Harlan's picture takes that situation and adds a whole bunch of insanity to this topic. Here we have 5 American students heading to the snowy Russian mountains where the '59 disaster took place. On a mission to unravel the strange disappearances of decades past, things go majorly awry when 3 of the students end up dead, and the other 2 find themselves left with quite the pickle. After being attacked by deformed mutants, the pair are stuck in a tiny cave-set bunker, with snarling beasts outside the door in freezing, foodless conditions. The duo of Jensen and Holly are confronted with only one option: to walk through a wormhole that's presented itself to them in said bunker. Upon doing so, the pair are sent back in time to 1959, where it's revealed that their time traveling has caused them to mutate. And yes, we then get the reveal that the mutated Jensen and Holly are one and the same mutants seen tormenting their future selves decades later. Number 3. Abducted by aliens. Area 51. When it comes to found footage horror movies, Oren Peli has a special place amongst this subgenre. Peli's the person responsible for rejuvenating this corner of horror, for better or for worse, with Paranormal Activity. Since that first PA picture was officially released in 2007, Peli's actually only directed one other movie, that being 2015's Area 51. As the title would suggest, this is a found footage film that focuses its attention on the famed classified United States Air Force base that resides in Nevada. After Reed Warner suspects he may have had an alien encounter of his own, he and his pals decide to infiltrate Area 51 to explore things further. The thing is, there are some matters you really shouldn't push back on, and in this case it was a hugely questionable decision to decide to head to Area 51 in search of aliens and answers. For this group, it's a case of be careful what you wish for, as the group do indeed find aliens, which in turn leads to them all being abducted as the picture comes to a close. Number 2. Deborah and Kara's Possession. The Taking of Deborah Logan. Adam Robitel's The Taking of Deborah Logan is a found footage movie that sheds some light on a topic that sadly impacted so many people. That, of course, is dementia, or to be specific in this case, Alzheimer's. For the struggling Deborah, we eventually find out that she's possessed by the spirit of Henri Desjardins, a deceased doctor who'd attempted to become immortal by ritually cannibalizing 5 young girls. Desjardins only managed to kill 4 of his intended 5 victims, but his intended 5th was Deborah's daughter Sarah. After learning of this, Jill Larson's character killed the doc and buried his body in order to protect her offspring. Nowadays though, the Desjardins-possessed Deborah is intent on taking young cancer patient Kara as his final victim, in turn granting him immortality. By the end of this picture, Deborah has unwillingly killed several people, and a final shot suggests that Desjardins was successful in now possessing the body of Kara. Number 1. Buried alive with your best friend's corpse. Megan is Missing. However you look at it, Megan is Missing is a seriously messed up movie, and the most messed up part of the film is its chilling final few minutes. To give a quick recap, this picture's based around 14-year-old Megan disappearing after meeting someone she met online. Megan's best pal Amy's on the hunt to find her friend, and this hunt sees her uncover security footage of Megan's kidnapping and then the titular character's subsequent torture. Just when you thought Megan is Missing was already majorly effed up, things get more ew-inducing as Amy continues her search. Said search search results in Amy herself being abducted, as the audience is shown a scene of her chained to a wall, begging for food, and then raped. That still wasn't enough for Megan is Missing, as her captor promises Amy freedom so long as she gets into a barrel. It's upon entering that barrel that Amy sees the dead, decaying corpse of her best friend. The barrel has its lid slammed shut and is then buried, meaning Amy's stuck in a tight space underground in darkness next to the rotting corpse of her best friend.
Within the depths of the horror genre, few subgenres have as varied quality as that of found footage. Some are hidden gems, some are absolute rubbish, but more often than not, they're all amazing when it comes to giving their characters fates worse than death. And as you might know by now, we here at What Culture love a little bit of this gimmick. I'm Josh from What Culture Horror, and these are 10 more found footage fates worse than death. Number 10, Corrupted by Ratman. VHS 94. I have 2 words that are going to define horror in 2021, and those are Hail Ratman. VHS 94 turned out to be an utter blast for horror hounds, with this being the second best top to bottom VHS release yet. Starting things off with a bang, we had the Storm Drain segment. As ever, this was a found footage affair, with the focus of this tale being reporter Holly and cameraman Jeff descending into a storm drain in search of the urban legend known simply as Ratman. This search brings Holly and Jeff to a group of homeless people, with one fella in particular grabbing their attention when he turns up covered in black goo. No doubt looking at this guy is like looking in a mirror if you've ever gone out on the session on a Friday and then crawled back home on a Monday morning. Rather than giving a proper interview to our protagonist though, this mystery man just spits up some strange black sludge and says the word Ratman. Spooked, Holly and Jeff run for safety, but instead end up captured and informed how a new world order will soon take over the world. After this, the half-man, half-rat Ratman makes himself known, and the monster spews up the same black liquid as the previous man did, which this time is rubbed on Jeff's face and burns him to death. Skipping ahead a little bit, we find Holly back at the news station and fronting a 2-headed local report. Unfortunately for her co-host though, this broadcast is brought to a halt when Holly vomits a black substance onto him and burns his freaking face off, before signing off from this news report with a Hail Ratman of her own. So yeah, if it's between having your face melted off and being mates with that rat freak, I know which one I'd pick anyway. Number 9, being in the literal belly of the beast, the Borderlands. Also known as Final Prayer in some regions, 2013's The Borderlands has an absolutely shocking ending that comes just a smidge out of nowhere. To set the stage, this Elliot Golden movie has 3 men, Father Mark, Brother Deacon, and tech expert Gray, sent by the Vatican to investigate spooky goings-on at an old church in a small Devon town. Before you know it, the local priest throws himself to death, the townsfolk are burning sheep, and our trio are made to feel a little bit uncomfortable in their mission. That mission culminates in a good old exploration between the 13th century church at the center of all of these shenanigans, with it being explained how said church was actually built on an old pagan temple. The worse than death fate for our central characters here is that their crawling through tight underground passages is revealed to actually have been them crawling through the stomach of some unknown creature. Rather than the tight walls, it's a belly that Deacon and Gray find themselves in, with Mark presumed dead or possessed or something. As digestive enzymes begin to burn the flesh of Deacon and Gray, that's when the Borderlands ends. Number 8, Manipulated by the Lennox Hotel. Followed is a film that poses the question of how far people will go to achieve online fame. For those who've heard the tales of the infamous Hotel Cecil in Los Angeles, California, this found footage movie features a variation of that locale called the Lennox Hotel. When fame-hungry social media enthusiast Mike is offered a big sponsorship deal to explore this haunted venue, he jumps at the chance of getting a hefty payday, bumping up his subscriber numbers, and of boosting his burgeoning online presence. When he and his crew head to the Lennox Hotel for 3 nights though, you end up cheering on the spirits and ghouls of the building in the hope that Mike meets a gnarly end. And he may not technically die by the time Followed concludes, but Mike is certainly corrupted by the hotel, with him seemingly possessed by the building once the credits hit, and him also becoming some sort of apparition who likewise looks to lure in other would-be bloggers. So yeah, I guess you could say that the influencer becomes the influenced by something else. Yeah, that's why he has more subscribers than I do. Number 7, responsible for 200 plus fates, Liv Scream. Released in 2018, Liv Scream is admittedly an extremely niche found footage movie. That said, it is a fun flick that builds some nice tension and has an imaginative plot at its core. That plot centers on Gunnar Willis's Scott, a man for whom the only thing he's good at in life is gaming. Yeah, it kinda sounds like another Scott I know. Nobody tell him I said that. Having failed at anything else he's tried his hand at, Scott starts to become a relatively successful video game streamer, and it's on this detail that Liv Scream hangs its hat. See, when Scott is sent a mysterious fan-made game to play, some of his watching followers are killed as and when the streamer screws up. With each new level bringing fresh new threats, Scott and his audiences are on edge about what awaits around the corner. Primarily framed through a relatively standard streaming setup, Liv Scream may be off-putting to those not familiar with streaming or those who'd rather not have to pay attention to chat screens and heavy text elements. For Scott here though, his mission is to try and keep as many of his 200 plus viewers alive as possible, which adds a whole other layer of pressure above and beyond merely trying to collect as many Chaos Emeralds as possible with Sonic the Hedgehog or something. Number 6, becoming a Bigfoot sex slave, Willow Creek. A Bigfoot enthusiast in real life, director Bobcat Goldthwait's first venture into horror put the Sasquatch legend in the spotlight. This found footage feature sees partners Jim and Kelly looking to seek out Bigfoot, and their quest ends pretty darn brutally. Of course, as any Bigfoot aficionado is aware, the purported hotspot for any BF activity is Willow Creek in Humboldt County, which is the location of that famed Patterson-Gimlin footage, and so that's where our lead characters head. As this movie enters its frantic final act though, Jim and Kelly are trapped in their tent as something awaits them outside. Deciding to make a break for it, the couple's escape plan is bizarrely halted by a naked woman as Jim ends up being killed by what is believed to be a Bigfoot. For Kelly, an even worse fate is awaiting, as the implication is that she too is to become one of these slaves for the scarce few remaining Sasquatches who wish to repopulate their numbers. Yeah, it's a bit minging, isn't it? Number 5, impregnated by Satan, All Hallows Eve. There's somewhat a caveat here when describing All Hallows Eve as a found footage movie. That's because the film plays as a traditional picture in some regards, with Sarah being a babysitter tasked with looking after Tia and Timmy on Halloween night. When the youngsters have a mysterious VHS tape in amongst their trick-or-treat goodies, curiosity gets the better of Sarah and she plays the tape and watches 3 stories recorded by Art the Clown. So does that make the Art shot footage the found variety? Well, kinda, and for the benefit of this list, let's just say that yes, it totally does. The first of these 3 tales Sarah watches is The Ninth Circle, which sees Art drug and kidnap a young woman called Casey. Awakening chained up in a room with 2 other ladies, Kristen and Sarah, Casey and Kristen decide to explore where their chains lead to once Sarah has been dragged away. Awaiting this duo, there's a bizarre humanoid creature who swiftly dismembers Kristen and accidentally frees Casey. This freedom is only fleeting though, because she ends up surrounded by hooded figures and has to watch these creeps pull a fetus from the womb of an unknown woman. Following that ordeal, the bizarre and brutal goes to an even more horrific level, as Casey is similarly assaulted by Satan as the Ninth Circle ends, implying that she'll suffer the same fate as this woman. Number 4, forever looking over your shoulder, The Bear. Changing pace from that pure grimness for a second, The Bear is a found footage movie that's framed as confidential US government reports being leaked out to the world. As is revealed at the end of the movie, the small seaside town of Claridge was involved in a cover-up over a swarm of isopods in the local water supply, with plentiful dead bodies amassed, usually after a person has either gone insane first and/or had their body eaten from the inside out, and blamed on swimming accidents, shark attacks, poisonous chicken feces, and even extreme bouts of food poisoning. The truth of the matter is the aforementioned isopods had been exposed to radioactive chemicals. The government finally does intervene and wipes out these isopods with chlorine, but then publicly states that all of this was just caused by strangely high water temperatures, as all survivors are paid off to keep silent. So when reporter Donna explains at the end of the movie how she is the one leaking all of this information out to the world, her fate is that she has to live forever looking over her shoulder after putting herself in the government's crosshairs. Number 3, roped into your wife's evil scheme, capture, kill, release. It's sometimes hard to be truly unique in the murky world of found footage films, but 2016's Capture, Kill, Release certainly does just that. The action here revolves around Jennifer and Farhang, with Jennifer revealing to her partner how she wants to make her own snuff movie. Having long dreamt of murdering someone, she now wants to do just that and record the whole procedure. For Farhang, he initially plays along with his love before he then starts to get cold feet on the whole killing matter. You know, because murder is wrong. Still, he's pressured and badgered into assisting Jennifer in finding her torture weapons of choice, deciding on a target, and then carrying out some truly heinous acts. In too deep at this point, he is a reluctant accomplice in the sinister intentions of his wife, and his partner forces him to do completely unspeakable things. The things we do for love though, eh? Number 2, being the motivation for a complete psychopath who's coming for you next. Be My Cat, a film for Anne. Likely to have flown under the radar of many, 2015's Be My Cat, a film for Anne is a distressing found footage feature about an Anne Hathaway obsessive. Playing somewhat like Patrick Brice and Mark Duplass's Creep, a film for Anne centers on a wannabe filmmaker called Adrian as he desperately tries to get Hathaway herself to visit Romania and star in his movie. In trying to lure Hathaway to sign up for his latest project, Adrian puts together test footage with a few aspiring local actresses. With his film titled Be My Cat focusing on a deranged Anne Hathaway fan, the lines become blurred between reality and fiction as Adrian flits between director and becoming his character of the deranged Hathaway fan. Pushing himself over the edge, Adrian ends up offing a few people before a film for Anne ends, with potential victim Alexandra convincing him to scrap his movie and just head for Hollywood to be with the real Anne Hathaway. And, in a surprise, Adrian decides to do just that, sparing Alexandra in the process. But for the in-universe Hathaway of this film, knowing that she'd fueled such depraved murders and that he's on his way to her next certainly wouldn't make for the easiest existence. Number 1, encountering Edward Carver, the Poughkeepsie Tapes. Along with Art the Clown of Terrifier fame, Edward Carver is likely the most messed up character introduced to horror audiences across the past decade or so. For those wondering, that's the name of the twisted figure at the center of the Poughkeepsie Tapes. While most experiences with Carver do end in bloody murder, usually after torture, sexual assault, and all kinds of grim, surreal, horrific mind games, even those who survive yearn for death. To hammer this point home in brutal fashion, longtime Carver captee Cheryl Dempsey is rescued from her tormentor's clutches at the close of the Poughkeepsie Tapes. Unfortunately though, Carver is such a psychopath that he's completely conditioned Cheryl to his horrible way of life, so much so that she can't function in any other environment. This is Carver's sick final act, even when a happy ending looks like it might be in sight. Consequently, by the time the movie wraps up, Cheryl twistedly misses him so much that she tragically takes her own life after not being able to fill the hole of being away from this sicko. So yeah, the moral is, if you're a victim of Edward Carver, he still wins even if you're saved because he gets in your head that much.
Now when we arrive at the cinema, beady-eyed and bushy-tailed, dead keen to find out which horror movie character is going to go splat and which will drag their mangled body over the finish line, we don't often expect to see characters caught in the middle ground. And yet, there's a certain subsection of directors and screenwriters whose mission it seems to be to leave their characters short of actually dying, but wishing they bloody well had done. So that's what we're here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 recent horror movie fates that were worse than death. Number 10, Come Down Bear, Cocaine Bear. Cocaine Bear promised to be the loosest, wildest creature featured this side of Snakes on a Plane, yet somehow it kinda got left in the dust. Nevertheless, this year's entry into the intoxicated Ursidae canon delivered just enough thrills and spills to keep us watching. Based on a true story, and as much that there was once a bear who ate a few grams and then died, the film takes artistic license with the story of a drug smuggler who died mid-job and left packages of the other white stuff strewn around a national forest, just in time for a big old black bear to chow down on. Limbs are torn, cartel kingpins are killed, and the bear at the heart of the whole caper gets a taste of a blow that could put Charlie Sheen to shame, consuming entire bricks of the stuff in single helpings. But what goes up must come down. A bear who has spent several days on the trot binging millions of dollars of coke is in for a shocker when the nose candy runs dry. We've all had rough mornings where death seems like a small mercy compared to our splitting headaches, dry throats and the like, but not like this. Not only will this be the come down from hell, the bear will be all on its lonesome facing addiction, withdrawal, and whatever permanent gut issues eating such quantities of this stuff will give you. Maybe the real bear got off lightly, you know what I'm saying? Number 9, Survivor's Guilt, Knock at the Cabin. M. Night Shyamalan caught the world by surprise this year by not actually Shyamalan-maning at all. The director is known for paradigm-shifting twists that have, for the past decade and a half, been the low-hanging fruit by which his films have been disparaged or dismissed, but not so with his most recent release, Knock at the Cabin. Here, a group of horsemen arrive at a remote cabin armed with homemade weapons and a holy mission. They take holidaymakers Eric, Andrew, and their adopted daughter Wen hostage, telling the dads if one of them doesn't kill the other, the world is going to come to an end. Because, okay then. As they near the point of no return, tsunamis engulf coastlines, planes fall from the sky, and a pandemic spreads across continents. And while most of us spend the duration waiting for the other shoe to drop, it never does. Andrew kills Eric and makes it out alive with Wen, actually legitimately preventing the end of the world. Now Andrew only has the rest of his life to think about what he did. It's hard to say what's worse, killing your partner or remaining indecisive enough to ensure the deaths of millions across the globe, but now he has all the time he needs to mull it over, all the time in the world. Number 8. Survivor's lack of guilt. Possessor. Brandon Cronenberg's second feature film Possessor may have been shot down by the pandemic, but it's certain to live on in the annals of psychological horror as a standout accomplishment in darkness and misery on a rather slender budget. Here we focus on Tasia Voss, an assassin existing in an alternate past, 2008 to be specific, who uses technology to take control of other bodies and complete her contracts, often forcing lovers, family members, and trusted confidants to murder one another. While the process may be nice and clean on paper and allows Voss and her organization to slip away without anyone knowing that they were there, little thought is given, at least on her part, to how the constant inhabitance of others' minds affects the user. She gradually slips away from normality, becoming distanced from her family life and constantly reliving the violence that she conducts in secret. By the time the chickens come home to roost, it is unfortunately too late to do anything about it. Stuck inside the body of one of her targets, Tasia willingly participates in the murder of her own husband and son, and becomes the perfect killer, free from all human attachments and really any reason for living in the first place. Number 7. Life-Altering Injuries. Scream 6. A trip to the big city was precisely what the Scream franchise needed, after the 5 previous films were spent essentially rerunning different variations of the same plot in and around the small death-stricken town of Woodsboro. Thus, number 6 transplants the action to New York City, kicking off the break from tradition with a shocking opening sequence Ghostface reveal, and things only get wilder from there, as the ghosts from Ghostface's past stalk our little group of survivors. Unfortunately, in breaking from tradition, Scream 6 doesn't necessarily know when to stop, and previously disposable characters can now suffer mortal wounds and just get back up for another movie. But that doesn't mean that the ramifications of such injuries can be treated so callously. I mean, just ask creaky, broken old Dewey from the franchise's last entry. And nobody should fear this more than Chad. Immediately after sealing the deal with his on-screen honey Tara, Chad falls victim to the killer's knives a dozen or so times and somehow survives. He may be laughing it off as he's wheeled into an ambulance at the end of the film, but there's a dozen fresh internal injuries on top of the 7 or so stabs that he received in the previous film. The amount of physical therapy, invasive surgery, and life-changing alterations coming his way, well, they're going to be no laughing matter at all. Number 6. Maiming Mum. Run. Run sees wheelchair-bound Chloe under the rule of Apache helicopter parent Diane, who controls every single last aspect of her disabled daughter's life, from medication to schooling and beyond. Suffering from arrhythmia, asthma, diabetes, hemochromatosis, and partial paralysis, Chloe has had a bit of a rough ride to say the least, but the discoveries that she makes when digging up dirt on her medication makes the whole situation a hell of a lot worse. And Annie Wilkes for the Z generation, Diane has been poisoning Chloe with, amongst other things, dog medication in order to keep her ill and under control, but most shockingly of all, confined to the wheelchair. Even once Diana has been caught and Chloe is off the meds, the effects are lasting, and Chloe has to use wheelchairs and canes for the rest of her life. The real sting of the film, however, comes at the very end. 7 years on, Diane is serving a lengthy sentence for her crime and appears to be bedbound, emaciated, and suffering from an unspecified illness. It turns out that Chloe has been paying her mother regular visits, smuggling pills into prison to keep Diane sedate, unwell, and, as seems to be the case, psychologically compromised. Ooh, what goes around, eh? Number 5. Slipping the Curse. Smile. Going where surprisingly few horror movies have gone before, Parker Finn's smile succeeded last year in making happiness creepy. While it made some of its bones on jump scares and familiar plot twists, the film nevertheless managed to put an indelible new image into our own memories, the bloody, fleshy villain known simply and fittingly as the Monstrosity. The largely invisible antagonist of the film, the Monstrosity's curse passes between individuals who have witnessed trauma, infecting their minds with hallucinations of manic, grinning friends, relatives, and co-workers, and driving them to near insanity before making them kill themselves. The next person in line is the one who witnesses the death, and so on, apart, that is, from Robert Talley. Incarcerated for life, Talley manages to find a way out of the vicious cycle by brutally murdering somebody else in front of a witness in order to pass it on to them. But did he think this through? Prison itself is no easy ride, but he has to live with the guilt and regret for what he did. On top of that, he'll never feel safe again. Gripped by the terror of having experienced the curse, fearful at every turn that it could come back to him again, does not seem like a good way to live at all. Number 4. Trapped in the windmills of Maddie's mind. Malignant. Malignant represents something of a return to form for James Wan, who had been out of the director's chair on a horror picture since 2016's Conjuring 2, which itself was slotted uncomfortably between Aquaman, which saw Jason Momoa and company ride sharks, and Furious 7, which saw Vin Diesel and company try to jump them. Cut loose from any of the horror series that made and perpetuated Wan's name, Malignant is a true original, centering around Maddie Mitchell and the seemingly supernatural connection that she shares with a murderous telepath, known as Gabriel, who has recently come out of hiding. As Maddie delves into her forgotten past, which began at a mysterious research hospital, she remembers the influence Gabriel used to have over her, encouraging her to do terrible things. And the reason for this? Well, Gabriel is neither a ghost nor a manifestation of mental illness. He is a parasite literally growing out of the back of her head. A fight for Maddie's body ensues, and after some seriously close shaves, our heroine triumphs. Good for Maddie, not so good for Gabriel. As she can't excise him entirely, she traps him in a pitch-black mindscape with a set of prison bars in order to keep him in, so he's destined to spend the rest of his life in the psychological equivalent of the abyss. Number 3. Becoming Candyman. Candyman 2021. When the decision was made to resurrect Candyman, few of us held our breath, suspecting another paint-by-numbers contemporary remake in the vein of 2009's Friday the 13th and 2010's A Nightmare on Elm Street that would probably add little to the legend and only exist to line studio executive pockets. And yet, in 2021's Candyman, the director managed to build upon the series' canon without sullying it, and in many places fixed the original film's problems by confronting issues of race and class. This time around, artist Anthony McCoy is the one caught in Candyman's honey, struggling to break through with his work on one side and on the other, consumed by an obsession with the original victim Helen Lyle's research and the grim fates of a string of black men generations before him. Unfortunately for Anthony, he undergoes a physical transformation that begins in a bee sting and spreads from his hand across his entire body. He's subsequently kidnapped, has his hand cut off, and is gunned down by the police. All in all, not a great day's Candyman in. Never mind the fact that as an artist, Anthony's hands are a fundamental part of his craft, he now has to exist for eternity in a limbo nether state as part of the Candyman hive, to be summoned back to reality by those curious enough to say his name in the mirror. Number 2. A Life Underground. Barbarian. What Barbarian loses in a confusion of plot lines and muddle of themes, it makes up for in creative scares and a deep and abiding terror that literally takes us beneath the idyllic sheen of suburbia. Suspicions are high from the outset as two Airbnbers double book the same property and wind up having to spend the night together in an otherwise abandoned neighborhood. And it doesn't help that one of them is Pennywise himself, Bill Skarsgård. However, the first night passes without incident, and it isn't until the second that things begin to unravel. The pair get stuck in the basement and discover several hidden areas, including a labyrinthine complex far underground. This is the lair of the Mother, a filthy, naked, subhuman brute who stalks the passages during the day and comes up into the house at night, seeking victims to become her children. But before we sharpen the pitchforks, there's a whole lot of backstory that might explain her behavior and her unavoidable predicament. It turns out the Mother has been forced to live underground, the product of an abusive rapist who kept women in the basement and bred from them and their children. She is the deformed product of generations of incest, alienated from society and unable to fully understand things, least of all, her own rather miserable situation. And number 1, Permanent Vacation in Hell. Daniel Isn't Real. A film that would make both of the Cronenbergs proud, hellish psychological body horror Daniel Isn't Real courts controversy from its pants-on-fire title onwards, opening with a child witnessing a mass shooting in a coffee shop and really going to hell and back. Protagonist Luke Nightingale was the aforementioned child, who now suffers from poor mental health and seeks the return of his invisible friend Daniel, who encourages him to do ever more dangerous and violent things. As it turns out, Daniel is a very real parasitic demon who is on a mission to make Luke's body his own, and very nearly does. Luke is hypnotized by a therapist, allowing Daniel the leeway to take over his body and trap him in the castle, an otherworldly dimension that manifests as a hellish version of the dollhouse that Luke trapped Daniel in when he was a child. But although he teeters on the precipice of damnation, it's not actually Luke who suffers the worst fate of all. You see, Luke eventually breaks free, but while stuck inside Daniel's dark place, which is somewhere between hell and the abyss. Here he encounters a wretched beast with a thorny, melted face. The Hell Beast is in fact John Thigpen, the coffee shop killer from the very beginning of the movie. He's been deformed by Daniel into something unspeakable and cursed to haunt this hellscape forever. So yeah, all in all, Luke gets off pretty lightly here.